Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, you'll learn how to use the useEffect React hook to fetch a dad joke from an API, as well as how to fetch a new joke anytime you want with just a press of a button. So in the project files, you'll see that you have a starter project as well as a finished project. And what we're going to do today is focus on the starter project and make sure that we go ahead and incorporate useEffect and useState React hooks in it in order to pull down the data from an API and then display it in state and then display that state in the DOM. We also want to make sure that once we click on this button, it's going to fetch a new joke here and display it in the DOM as well. So if we come into our starter project and come up to source, components, card, and then open the card.jsx file, which I have already open, and if we scroll down, you'll see between this H1, we currently just have the joke hard-coded here. And this another one button, once we click on that, all it's going to do is print "you clicked me" into the console. So in order to get started with the setting up the API so we can fetch data from it, I'm going to be using a tool called Axios. Now you could use something like the Fetch API, but in this case I want to use Axios. And in order to install Axios specifically using Code Sandbox, we need to add a dependency to Code Sandbox. And to do that, it's really simple. We just come down here to the Add Dependency button. We search for what we want to add, which in this case is Axios. Then we can click here, and then it's going to add it to our project. And you can see under dependencies, we now have Axios. And now that we have this installed in our project, all we need to do is import it here at the top. So it's import Axios from Axios. All right. So now that it's imported, we can use it here in our code. Now, I've mentioned that we're going to be using the useEffect React hook in order to fetch the data. So in order to start using the useEffect, we can go ahead right before our return here in our card component, and we can write out useEffect. And we need to make sure that this is pulling in from React. So in order to make sure we import it, we'll come up here and in curly brackets, import useEffect. All right, so now that we have useEffect here, the next thing we want to do is create an arrow function. So I'm going to do an arrow function here. And in here, I'm going to create a new function called fetchData, which is an asynchronous function. And the way you call asynchronous functions within the useEffect React hook is first by declaring the function and then calling the function before the useEffect hook ends. So let's go ahead and just show you what that looks like. So we'll do const fetch data, then async. This is going to be another arrow function here. And here we want to set another constant to results and set that equal to await. And then we can call Axios. And then here is where we call the API. And I found a really awesome dad joke API here on Rapid API. And what we want to do is we want to call this URL. And then down here in the docs, you can see that we have different endpoints that we can call. And we're going to call this one the random joke type and then set the type to general. That way we're only getting, general jokes instead of knock knock or programming jokes. So let's go ahead and copy this URL, paste it here in between the parentheses. Then we can say random /type /general. All right, so now that we have this result, because we're using Axios, we can read data off of this result. And so let's go ahead and just do that now. So we'll console log result.data. So let's go ahead and save that. And before this works, we need to go ahead and call this function. And we do that right outside of the function. So we'll say fetch data and call that right there. So now that we did that, you can see here, once this finishes rebuilding, we have this object here. It's a little hard to see. I apologize about that. See if I can zoom in. And in this object, we have an array. And the first item has some data off of it. It has an ID. It has the punchline, which is like the part that makes the joke funny. And then the setup, which is the question. And it also has the type, which is set to general. All right, so now that we have this data coming in, we can go ahead and set this data on some type of state value. And in order to set up state value here in our function component, we want to use another React hook called useState. So let's go ahead and use that right above useEffect. So the way we want to declare this is first creating a constant. And this constant's going to have an array, and this array, the first value in the array is the state value, so the name of the state value. In this case, we're going to call it joke. And the next one is the function you use in order to change that state value. In this case, we're going to call it setJoke. Then we set that equal to useState. And then we can, in here, pass in a default value. In this case, this is going to be an empty string. And we need to make sure we import this at the top as well. So let's go ahead and save that. And now that we have this value, we can use it here to show it in the DOM. So let's come down here to our h2 tag, delete this hard-coded joke, and then pass in the joke like this. So once you save that, this should go away and it should just be an empty string. Perfect. All right, so now that we have that set up, we can now use this setJoke function in order to update the joke state value. And where do we do that? Well, we want to do that right here where we wrote this console.log. So let's go ahead and just comment this out. And below this, we want to go ahead and call setJoke. And we want to set this joke to a string. And I'm going to use string interpolation here so we can use some of the values from this result and pass it into a string. So in order to do that, we first write the $sign with the curly brackets and then the variable that we want access to, so result.data. Remember, we want to get the first object here of the array, so we're going to do 0. And what we want to get off of that is first the setup, which is the question for the joke. Then let's go ahead and just copy this. And still in this string, I'm going to give this a space. Paste that in. Instead of setup, we're going to do the punchline. And actually, before we save that, we first need to pass in another argument here on the useEffect. And at the end here, it takes an argument of an array. And in this array, we're telling what this useEffect is dependent on. Now, if we left it empty, it's just going to render once the component mounts. And if we didn't even include this, we're going to have an endless loop, and it's just going to continue fetching new jokes over and over and over again. So let's make sure that we include this empty array here. And the error is because for some reason I don't have a curly bracket here. So let's make sure we have that. And once we save that, we can now see that we are getting a joke pulling in from the API. Cool. So another thing we might want to do is show a loading icon or animated SVG here in order to show to the user that this request is coming, but we're still waiting on the joke to come back from the API. And what we can do here is use another state value, something like set to something like loading. And if loading is true, we'll show an animated SVG, which is going to show like a loading screen or a loading icon. And if it's not, we'll show the joke. So first thing we need to do is go ahead and set up that state value. So up here where we declared the joke state value, we'll do another one called loading. Set this to set loading. We'll say useState, and we'll set this one to true. So let's go ahead and save that. And now what we can do is use a ternary operator below in order to conditionally render it. So let's go ahead and scroll down here. And right above where the joke is, I'm going to write a ternary operator. So let's go ahead and do curly brackets. And then we're going to say loading. So this is going to say, hey, is loading true? And if it is, we want to render something. And what do we want to render? We want to render an image. And we want to set this image, whoops. And then we can set a class name here. And I'm actually using a library called Emotion, which is a CSS and JS library, which is why you see the CSS here in this component. I'm not going to go over that specifically in this video, but just know that's where or how I'm adding the CSS here. So I'm just going to add a margin here of 40 pixels. And now that we have that, we need to go ahead and set a source. I'm just going to set that to an empty string, set Alt to loader. And we need to make sure that we close this image tag. All right, so now that we have that, outside of this parentheses where we have the render, we can write the rest of the ternary operator. So else, if this is false, we want to render something else. And what we want to render here is the joke. So let's go ahead and just cut the joke out here. Save that. And we're going to get this, right now we're actually not using an image right here, which is why this is showing up like this. So now that we have that, we need to go ahead and use some type of image here. And what I did is I used an image SVG from Sam Herbert, this SVG loaders project in GitHub. And you can go ahead and click here to see some of the examples. And the one we're going to be using is, I think this one, the oval example. So let's go back to GitHub. And the easiest way to get started here is I'm just going to come into SVG loaders, come down to the oval SVG, and click on raw. And just copy the SVG code right here, come back to our project. And in images, I already have this, but I'm going to create a new file and then paste the SVG code here. And the only thing I'm going to change is the stroke hex code here to a different color. So just pause the video if you want to use the same one and make sure that yours is set to the same. All right, so once you have that in your images folder under the source, we need to go ahead and import that oval. So I'm going to scroll up to the top. And the way we do that is say import, and then the name of whatever we want to import. So oval from, and then the location of this relative to the card component file. So that's going to be 2up in images. And the name of that is oval.svg. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we can use this oval name here in the source. So let's go ahead and declare that here instead of an empty string. So oval. And if we save that, we should see the oval SVG. All right. So right now it's always going to be showing because the default value is true. And we currently don't have any logic here that changes that. And it's really simple to get this set up. So the first thing we want to do is we want to, in this async call, I want to go ahead and say set loading to true. Okay. And once this gets done, and once set joke is set, we want to go ahead and say set loading to false. So set loading to false. So now you'll see it in the beginning. The joke loads in. So let's go ahead and refresh that, see if you can see it. You'll see that the component is going to eventually come up. You can see the loader. And then once this is set, the loader goes away and the joke is shown to you. All right, so now the only thing that's left to do is to make sure that once we click on this, it's doing more than just printing "you clicked me" to the console. And remember here in the useEffect, we have this array which we can set variables to that are dependent on this useEffect. So once those variables change, useEffect is going to rerun. So an easy way to do this in this example is to come down and in here, essentially treat this button as a toggle. So once we click on it, it's going to set some state value. It's going to switch between true and false. Now, whatever true and false is doesn't really matter. The fact is that that state is changing. And because it's changing, this is going to rerun again, and it's going to fetch a new joke and display it in the DOM. So what we need to do is we need to create a new state variable, pass it in as a dependent here on the useEffect, and then call that function down here on this p tag when we say onClick. So let's go ahead now and go ahead and define that state value here. So const, we can set this something to something like fetching, then set fetching. We can say useState, and we can set the default here to false. And now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and set fetch here as a dependent for this useEffect. Excuse me, fetch. Let's go ahead and, fetching. Let's do fetching. And now we can go ahead and call set fetching below. So let's come down here. Instead of console.log, we will say set fetching. And what we can do is set it opposite to its current value. And a quick way of writing that is with an exclamation point and then the name of the current state value for fetching. So if we save that, once we click on this, we should be getting a new joke. So let's go ahead and click on this. And there you go. Every time we click on it, you're going to get a new joke fetching from the API. I hope you learned a lot in this video about React Hook, specifically the useEffect and useState React Hook. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And be sure to check out our other design and development courses on our YouTube channel and on skillthrive.com. Again, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and I'll see you in the next video.